The night of the storm. The wind howled like a wild beast, rattling the windows of the small mobile home as Cass and I sat huddled together on the worn-out couch. It was August, height of summer, but the storm that had rolled in from nowhere had turned the air cold and filled the sky with dark, menacing clouds. Our plan for a peaceful weekend getaway in the countryside quickly turned into something out of a nightmare. I had always loved our family's rustic mobile home, nestled deep in the woods upstate. It was a simple place, just one bedroom, a small living room with a pull-out couch, a bathroom, and a tiny kitchen. It was the kind of place where you could disconnect from the world, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. But tonight, those peaceful sounds had been replaced by the relentless roar of the storm. Cass and I had arrived on Friday, excited for a weekend of archery, dirt biking, and just relaxing away from the hustle of the city. The mobile home had running water, electricity, and even a small TV with a DVD player. We joked that it was luxury camping, and it kind of was. After unpacking and settling in, we went out to eat, did some grocery shopping, and then spent the evening curled up on the couch, watching movies as the first rumblings of thunder echoed in the distance. By Saturday, the storm had fully arrived. The sky was an angry shade of gray, and the air was thick with the promise of rain. We spent the morning enjoying the activities we had planned, but by afternoon, the clouds had darkened, and we could feel the storm building. Deciding it was better to be safe than sorry, we packed away our gear and retreated inside just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. As the rain turned into a torrential downpour, we made dinner together, the sound of the storm outside growing louder with each passing minute. By the time we sat down to eat, the thunder was crashing directly overhead, and the flashes of lightning were so bright they lit up the entire sky. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small and insignificant, a reminder of the raw power of nature. We decided to sit outside on the deck under the small canopy to watch the storm, despite the rain. It was exhilarating, the lightning streaking across the sky in jagged lines, the thunder booming so close it felt like the ground was shaking. Cass and I held hands, enjoying the thrill of being right in the heart of the storm. But then, we heard it. A voice, faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was out in the woods, calling out. The sound was garbled by the wind and rain, but it was definitely a voice. "Did you hear that?" Cass asked, her grip on my hand tightening. "Yeah," I replied, straining to listen over the roar of the storm. "It's probably just a hiker. Maybe they got lost." But even as I said the words, a cold knot of fear began to form in my stomach. The place was remote. Really remote. The nearest town was miles away, and the trails around here weren't exactly popular. Hearing another person out here, especially in weather like this, was more than just unusual. It was downright eerie. I stepped to the edge of the deck, squinting into the darkness. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the flashes of lightning were the only thing giving me brief glimpses of the woods beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Figure, maybe, standing just at the edge of the trees. "There's someone out there," I whispered, not wanting to alarm Cass any more than she already was. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we should go inside." "Yeah, maybe you're right," I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. The last thing I wanted to do was freak her out. Something about this situation was setting off alarm bells in my head. We quickly moved back inside, shutting and locking the door behind us. I pulled the curtains closed, hoping to shut out whatever was lurking out there in the storm. Cass was visibly shaken, and I didn't blame her. This was supposed to be a fun weekend, and now it felt like we were in the middle of some horror movie. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm outside. Every creak of the old mobile home, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made us jump. I could tell Cass was trying to stay calm. I could see the fear in her eyes. I felt it too, that gnawing sense of dread that something was very wrong. "I'm sure it was just a lost hiker," I said, more to reassure myself than her. "They'll probably just keep going." Cass nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Neither was I, really. After a few more minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if that person was still out there. I got up and walked over to the window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing just a few feet from the deck, was a man. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his body, his face partially obscured by the rain. But what really scared me was how still he was. He wasn't moving, wasn't even trying to get out of the rain. He was just standing there, staring at the house. I quickly closed the curtain and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I go out there? Should I confront him? Or should I just stay inside and hope he went away? "Cass," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's someone out there. Just stay calm, okay?" "What? Who is it?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know, but I don't think they're here for help." Cass's eyes widened and she clutched the blanket tighter around herself. "What do we do?" "I don't know," I admitted. Maybe we should just wait and see if they leave. If they come to the door, we'll figure something out." We sat in tense silence for what felt like an eternity, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Every now and then, I thought I could hear footsteps outside, but it was hard to tell over the noise of the storm. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing seemed right. All I knew was that I didn't want to open that door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm began to die down. The thunder became more distant, and the rain slowed to a steady drizzle. The air inside the mobile home felt thick with tension, and I could see Cass was on the verge of tears. "We can't just sit here," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We have to do something." I knew she was right, but I didn't want to admit it. Thought of opening that door, facing whoever was out there, filled me with a fear I hadn't felt since I was a kid. But I couldn't let that fear paralyze me. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Okay, I'm gonna check it out. Stay here." "No, please don't go out there," Cass begged, grabbing my arm. "What if they're dangerous?" "I'll be careful, promise," trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just stay here and lock the door behind me." I gently pulled her hand off my arm and made my way to the front door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, then slowly turned the handle, bracing myself for whatever might be on the other side. The door creaked open, and I stepped out onto the deck, cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I looked around, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of the man I had seen earlier. The woods were dark and silent, the only sound the soft patter of rain on the leaves. I took a few cautious steps forward, peering into the darkness. Maybe he had left. Maybe he had just been some lost hiker after all, and he had moved on when the storm started to let up. I wanted to believe that. Something told me it wasn't that simple. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, and for a brief moment, I saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at me. He was closer now, only about 20 feet away. His eyes were wide and empty, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. "He's still out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "He's just standing there." Cass didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was terrified, and so was I. We were trapped in this tiny mobile home with no way to call for help, no way to get out. I felt completely powerless. "We need to stay calm," I said, more to myself than to her. We'll just wait it out. He can't stay out there forever." But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that whoever this person was, they weren't going to leave. Every time I looked out the window, he was there, just standing at the edge of the woods, watching. The rain had all but stopped now, but the air was still thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. I was about to suggest we try to make a run for the car when there was a sudden loud bang at the bedroom window. Cass let out a scream, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed the rifle from under the bed, my hands shaking as I loaded it. Another bang, this time from the kitchen window. It was like they were trying to break in, testing each window, each door. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, to protect us. I moved to the front door, positioning myself so that if anyone tried to come through, I'd be ready. I could feel the cold metal of the rifle in my hands, and for a moment, I felt a surge of confidence. I wouldn't let them hurt us. They tried to get in, I'd shoot. The banging continued, echoing through the small mobile home like a drumbeat. Cass was huddled in the bedroom, crying softly, and I felt a wave of guilt for dragging her into this. This was supposed to be a fun weekend, and now we were fighting for our lives. Then, without warning, the banging stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the next move, and then I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound outside the front door, like someone was trying to turn the handle. My grip tightened on the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. I was ready. I wouldn't let them get in. The shuffling continued for a moment, and then there was a soft click. The door slowly began to creak open. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open the rest of the way and fired the rifle into the air, the sound deafening in the quiet night. Figure on the other side of the door stumbled back, letting out a deep, guttural yell before turning and running into the woods. I stood there, panting, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear at least 2 voices shouting as they disappeared into the darkness, the sound growing fainter until there was nothing left but the distant rumble of thunder. I stood there for a long moment, the rifle still raised, my hands shaking. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but they were gone now. We were safe. For now. Finally, I lowered the rifle and went back inside, locking the door behind me. Cass was still in the bedroom, her face pale and tear-streaked. I sat down next to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as her. "They're gone." We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the old mobile home. The men didn't come back. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up our things and left, not daring to stay another minute. As we drove away, the events of the night before played over and over in my mind. Who were those men? What did they want? I didn't have any answers, and maybe I never would. All I knew was that something had changed. That place, once a sanctuary, now felt tainted, like a shadow had fallen over it. I've been back to the mobile home a few times since then, always with my family. Never alone. But the memory of that night still haunts me. Every time I hear the sound of thunder, I'm taken back to that dark, stormy night, and I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't fired that rifle? What if they had gotten in? The storm may have passed, but the fear it brought with it still lingers, like a stain that will never fully wash away. The storm that never ended. I never thought in a million years that anything truly horrific would ever happen to me. I'm an average person with a life so uneventful that anything out of the ordinary would stand out like a beacon. That's why I always felt comfortable watching horror movies, listening to creepy stories on YouTube, and diving into the eerie world of creepypasta. The thrill was always there, but it was safe, or at least, it used to be. Now, after what happened, those stories terrify me in a way I never thought possible. It all started on a night that seemed no different from any other. It was around 4 a.m., and everyone else in the house was asleep, my mother and both of my grandparents. For the past couple of months, we had been getting at least one major thunderstorm each week. This one had decided to start earlier that night, and it was a monster. I've always enjoyed a good thunderstorm, especially at night. There's something mesmerizing about sitting by the window, watching the lightning dance across the sky. But the wind, that's something that's always unsettled me. It can be soft and gentle one moment, and then suddenly become deafening, as if the very air around you is trying to tear your world apart. This night's storm was one of the worst we'd had in a long time. It sounded like rocks were pelting against my window, and the wind howled like a beast in agony. But despite the chaos outside, I was content, nestled under my blankets, scrolling through Reddit on my phone. That's when the power went out. 1 second, everything was fine, and then the next, I was plunged into complete darkness. I'm not gonna lie, it was creepy. But I didn't panic. I had my phone, a decent charge, and mobile data. I could keep browsing, keep my mind occupied. After a while though, fatigue started to creep in. I figured it was time to get some sleep, so I placed my phone on the side table and rolled over, hoping to drift off despite the storm still raging outside. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly because the next thing I remember was the eerie silence. The rain had stopped, and the wind had died down to a soft whisper. I rolled over, trying to get more comfortable, but I couldn't ignore the parched feeling in my mouth. I tried to fall back asleep, but it wasn't happening. My throat was too dry. I needed water. Reluctantly, I sat up, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, guiding me as I made my way to the kitchen. The moment I opened my bedroom door, I was hit by a blast of cold air. It was freezing in the living room, way colder than it should have been. I quickly threw on a sweater and continued to the kitchen, chill gnawing at my nerves. As I approached the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The wind seemed louder, and the temperature kept dropping. I reached the kitchen and froze. The door to the patio was wide open. A wave of fear washed over me. My mind raced through the possibility. Had someone broken in? Was someone still inside? I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe my grandfather had left it open earlier and just forgot to close it. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't ease the knot of dread forming in my stomach. I walked over to the sliding door, glancing over my shoulder out of sheer paranoia, and slid it shut, locking it. Fear that someone might be in the house gnawed at me, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Fast walked back to my room, shut the door behind me, and locked it, good measure. Placed the glass of water on my side table, my hand shaking slightly as I did so. The house was silent, save for the soft whine of the wind outside. I laid back down, still clutching my phone like a lifeline, flashlight casting shadows across the walls. Tried to relax, to let the familiar comfort of my bed lull me back to sleep. The unease wouldn't go away. Something inside me kept screaming there might be someone in the house, that I hadn't checked well enough. With a sigh, I got out of bed again and dragged a chair over to the door, wedging it under the knob to keep anyone from coming in. I checked the closet one more time, just to be sure, then laid back down, my heart still pounding in my chest. I kept the flashlight on this time, like a makeshift nightlight, and that's when it happened. I felt a slight bump from underneath my bed, followed by the creak of bed springs. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't checked under the bed. My stomach churned with fear. I leaned over the side of the bed, shining the flashlight into the darkness beneath. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. There, staring back at me from under the bed, was an emaciated woman. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes bloodshot and her teeth yellowed and jagged. It was her smile that terrified me the most, a wide, unnatural grin that seemed to stretch from ear to ear. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then she cackled, a high-pitched maniacal laugh that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't think, I just moved. I leapt out of bed and sprinted to the door, knocking the chair aside. My hand fumbled with the lock, but I managed to get it open and bolted down the hall to my grandparents. Grandpa, Grandpa, I screamed, banging on the door with all my might. Within seconds, my grandfather threw open the door, look of confusion and concern on his face. He held a gun in his hand, something I'd never even known he had in the house. "There's someone in my room," I cried, tears streaming down my face. She was under my bed. Without a word, my grandfather moved past me, gun at the ready. My grandmother followed close behind, her face pale with fear. I trailed after them, my heart pounding in my ears. When we reached my room, my grandfather moved cautiously inside, his eyes scanning every corner. It was too late. As we entered, we caught a glimpse of a white figure slipping out the window and disappearing into the night. My grandfather fired a shot into the darkness. A warning, the figure was gone. We didn't call the police. My grandparents figured there wasn't much they could do. We didn't have security cameras, and we had no idea who the woman was or what she wanted. Over the next few days, we had new locks installed on all the windows and doors. My grandfather even installed a security system, something we'd never felt the need for before. But none of it helped me sleep at night. The nightmares started soon after. I'd see her face every time I closed my eyes, her twisted grin haunting me. I started sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. The fear was always there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I tried to tell myself that it was over. She was gone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A few weeks later, I learned the truth. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on a book, when my grandfather came in looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "David, we need to talk," he said, voice heavy. I looked up at him, my stomach twisting with unease. "What's wrong?" He sat down across from me, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "I did some digging. I found out who that woman was." My blood ran cold. "Who was she?" "She was a patient at a nearby mental institution," he began, his voice low. "She escaped a few months ago. They've been looking for her ever since, but she's been hiding out in the area." I felt like I was going to be sick. "Why was she in our house?" My grandfather hesitated, as if he wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say. "David, she thought this was her house. She was convinced that you were her son." The room started to spin. I could barely process what he was telling me. "What? She lost her son in a car accident years ago," my grandfather explained. "After that, she had a mental breakdown. She started believing that her son was still alive, that he was hiding from her. When she saw the light in your room, she must have thought that you were him." The horror of it all crashed down on me like a wave. This woman, this disturbed, broken woman, had been living in a nightmare of her own. And in that nightmare, I was her son. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, still searching for her son. And sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the rain pounds against the windows, I think I can hear her voice calling out from the darkness. "David? Where are you, David?" And that's when I know she's never going to stop looking. The Lake's Whisper. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. Almost 60 years old now, with the aches and pains to prove it, but there's still nothing in this world that calls to me like the pull of a fish on the end of my line. It's the one constant in a life full of changes. My kids have grown up, moved out, and started their own lives, leaving the house eerily quiet. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. I used to miss the noise, the energy, especially the sound of my boys throwing the football around in the yard. Those days are long gone, though. Time moves on, and so must we, I suppose. These days, I mostly fish alone. My old college buddies don't have the stamina for it anymore, and, well, neither do I, if I'm being honest. But the solitude doesn't bother me. In fact, there's something about the isolation that I've come to appreciate. Just me, the water, and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. Peaceful, or at least it usually is. It was mid-April, just after the ice had melted from the lakes up here in upstate New York. Perfect timing for an early season fishing trip. The crisp air still carried a bite, but the promise of warmer days was just around the corner. For some reason, I found myself craving a more secluded spot this time. Maybe it was the silence at home that drove me to it, or maybe it was just the pull of the unknown. Whatever it was, I decided to try a nondescript lake tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far from the usual spots. It was a small lake, almost like it didn't want to be found. I left the house well before sunrise, my old Volvo humming along the winding roads like it always had. The drive was uneventful, and by the time the sky began to lighten, I was there, staring out at a stretch of water that looked more like glass than a lake. I strapped my kayak off the roof, feeling that familiar thrill I always get just before I hit the water. The lake was still as I paddled out to the middle, the only sound being the soft ripple of water against the hull. The sky was starting to come alive with color, hues of orange and pink dancing along the horizon. It was a sight that would make you believe in God, if you didn't already. I started setting up, my hands moving with the ease of decades of practice. I was aiming for largemouth bass, so I rigged up my usual setup. 6.5-foot medium action spinning rod, 9-pound monofilament line, and a 4-inch rubber stickworm, wacky rigged. It was my go-to, never failed me before. But just as I was about to cast, something caught my eye. Across the lake, barely visible in the dim morning light, there was movement. At first, I thought it was another fisherman, but something didn't sit right. figure was too stiff, too deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my binoculars, the ones I keep for bird watching, and focused on the far shore. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark clothing, hoods pulled up over their heads. They were digging, frantically, like they were racing against time. The hole wasn't deep, just enough to conceal whatever they were hiding. My heart started to pound. I didn't like this, not one bit. I watched as they pulled something out of the ground, something I couldn't quite make out, even through the binoculars. Each of them took turns removing items, their movements hurried and desperate. Then, one by one, they began tossing the objects into the lake. Each splash echoed across the water, sharp and final. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. I didn't know what they were up to, but it was bad news. Bad news that I wanted no part of. Fear settled in, heavy and cold. I lowered the binoculars and started to turn my kayak away, but something stopped me. Curiosity? Stubbornness? I don't know. All I knew was that I couldn't just leave without knowing what they were hiding. I waited, heart pounding, until they finished their grim task. The figures glanced around nervously before disappearing into the woods, leaving nothing but a disturbed patch of earth and ripples on the water. My hands were shaking as I paddled over to the spot where they'd been standing. The morning was still, almost eerily so, as I dropped anchor and cast my line. Not for fish this time, for answers. I fished around for nearly an hour with no luck. Frustration was gnawing at me, mixing with the fear that still lingered. I was about to give up when an idea struck me. My depth checker? It was back in the car, tucked away with the rest of my gear. I paddled back to shore, moving as quickly as I could without tipping the kayak, and retrieved it. Sweat was beading on my forehead as I returned to the spot. The depth checker hummed softly as I scanned the lake bottom. For a while, it was just mud and silt, nothing unusual. But then, I felt it. Hard, metallic object buried just beneath the muck. My hands trembled as I switched my rig, replacing the worm with the largest hook I had. This was no ordinary catch. I let the line out slowly, my finger resting lightly on it, feeling for the slightest tug. When it came, I almost dropped the rod. I reeled in carefully, each turn of the handle sending a jolt of anticipation through me. Whatever was on the end of that line was heavy, and as it broke the surface, felt my blood run cold. It was a gun, black 9mm, waterlogged but unmistakable. I stared at it, the reality of what I'd found crashing down on me. Those men had thrown a gun into the lake. I didn't even want to think about why. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it back into the water. Somehow, I managed to reel it into the kayak without touching it. My mind racing. I had to get out of there. Fast. The paddle back to shore was a blur. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. As soon as I hit dry land, I called the police. My voice was shaking as I told them what I'd found, but they took me seriously. Full investigation was launched, and I was there to watch every second of it. They found more than I ever could have imagined. Keychain with 7 keys, old foreign coins wrapped in a cloth, and the most unsettling thing of all, a locket. It was waterlogged. Pictures inside faded beyond recognition. The police said they'd contact me if they could piece together what any of it meant, but the call never came. I tried to forget about it, but that night, I heard voices in my front yard. "That was the car, I know it," someone whispered. I peeked out the window, my heart in my throat. Shadows moved around the yard, figures darting in and out of view. They never rang the bell, never knocked on the door. They just circled my house, like wolves sizing up prey, and then they were gone. I called the police again, desperate to reopen the investigation, but it went nowhere, and the questions haunted me. Why were those items buried? Why did they go back to dig them up, only to throw them into the lake? Was it panic? Change of plan? Or something more sinister? Weeks passed, and the fear began to fade, but it never fully left me. I stopped fishing for a while, the lake holding a darkness that I couldn't shake. The quiet of my house became unbearable, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, every creak and groan of the old house sending my heart racing. One night, as I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, I heard it again. Faint whisper, just outside the window. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The words were muffled but unmistakable. "He knows," someone said. I bolted out of my chair, heart pounding. I grabbed the nearest thing to a weapon, a fireplace poker, and yanked open the door. But the yard was empty, the night silent. No shadows, no voices. Nothing but the wind rustling the leaves. I stood there trembling, the poker clutched in my hand, until the cold drove me back inside. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every noise, every creak sent me into a panic. I felt like a hunted animal, the walls of my own home closing in on me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left, heading south with no particular destination in mind. I couldn't stay in that house, not with the memories and the fear that had taken root there. I needed to get away, put as much distance between myself and that lake as possible. But even now, miles away, I can't escape it. Questions, the fear, the haunting memory of those men and what they did. I see them in my dreams, digging, burying, hiding. I hear the splash of the gun hitting the water, feel the weight of it on the end of my line, and always, I hear the whispers. He knows. What do I know? That's the real question, isn't it? What do I know, and what am I supposed to do with it? I've tried to forget, tried to move on, but some things stick with you, burrow into your soul like a tick, feeding on your peace of mind. And I know this much. Whatever those men were hiding, whatever they were so desperate to conceal, it wasn't meant to be found. Not by me, not by anyone. And now that I've found it, I don't think I'll ever be free of it. The lake called to me once, with its promise of peace and solitude. But now it's a place of nightmares, a dark and twisted reflection of everything I once loved about the water. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, I know that the lake will always be there, waiting. And so will they. Because they know too. They know I'll never stop wondering, and they'll never stop watching. Stormy night. It was a sticky August evening, the kind where the air clung to your skin, and the cicadas sang their relentless songs. Thunderstorms had rolled in earlier, and the sky was a swirling canvas of dark gray and violet. I was home alone for the first time overnight. The thrill of it made my heart beat a little faster. I was 13, and my parents had just started trusting me enough to leave me alone while they visited my aunt 2 towns over. "You know the rules, David," my mom had said, her face serious but kind. "No leaving the house, no visitors, and if anything happens, call us right away." "Got it, Mom," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My dad ruffled my hair, and they both headed out into the growing storm. As the rumble of their car faded into the distance, I closed the door and locked. The house was mine for the night. A sense of freedom mixed with an edge of unease settled over me. I had big plans. Move the Xbox downstairs, hook it up to the big TV, and play video games until my eyes bled. But first, I decided to enjoy the storm. There was something about thunderstorms that always fascinated me. A sort of primal energy that made the world feel alive and dangerous. I went out to the front porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The wind was picking up, rattling the chimes that hung from the porch roof. I could smell the rain before it started. Clean, earthy scent mixed with something else, something that reminded me of my grandfather. He had passed away a few years ago, but his memory was still vivid. He had a distinct scent, a mix of old leather, tobacco, and something sweet like vanilla. I missed him, especially during nights like these when I could have used his company. The first raindrops started to fall, fat and heavy, splashing against the pavement and creating tiny craters in the dust. The thunder was getting louder, rolling across the sky like the approach of some ancient beast. I leaned against the porch railing, letting the cool rain mist my face. "David, get in here. It's gonna pour." Cody's voice crackled through the headset hanging around my neck. He was my best friend, and we had planned to meet online as soon as I was ready. "Hold on, Cody. Just watching the storm for a bit." "You're weird, man. Get inside before you get struck by lightning." I laughed, but decided he was right. I was getting soaked, and the rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof and splashing against the windows. I stepped back into the house, screen door slamming shut behind me. The living room was dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the room in stark white light. I shivered a little, more from the excitement than the cold. I moved my Xbox from my room to the den, the downstairs room with the biggest TV. My dad's prized flat screen was mounted on the wall, and it was the only time I was allowed to use it without supervision. I set everything up, hooked up the Bose sound system, and turned the volume up to a level that would have my dad scolding me if he were home. The game booted up, and I lost myself in the virtual world. The storm outside was a perfect backdrop to the chaos on the screen. I was playing some online multiplayer game, chatting with Cody as we ran through the map, hunting down enemies. "Yo, that was a sick shot," Cody yelled as I took out an opponent from a distance. "Thanks, man. I've been practicing," I replied, grinning. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was drowned out by the explosions and gunfire coming from the speakers. I was in the zone, my fingers moving fast over the controller, when the doorbell rang. I paused, the sound jarring against the backdrop of the storm and the game. Who could that be at this hour? It was almost 9 p.m., and the storm outside was getting worse. I told Cody about it. "Dude, who's at your door this late?" Cody asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I don't know. My parents aren't due back until tomorrow." "Maybe it's them then. They would have called if they were coming home early, right?" "Yeah, probably. But my parents wouldn't ring the doorbell. They had keys." I stood up, feeling a knot of unease form in my stomach. I put the controller down and started toward the door, but then I hesitated. Maybe I should just ignore it. After all, it was probably someone lost. Maybe their car broke down in the storm. But then the doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I moved to the front door, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I stood in front of the door, the rain hammering down on the roof just above me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then a voice answered from the other side, deep and rough. "I need to use your phone. My car broke down." Something about the voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just that it was deep, there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. "I can't help you," I stammered. "Sorry." There was a long silence, and I thought for a moment that whoever it was had gone. But then the voice came again, more forceful this time. "Come on, kid. Just let me in. I'm stranded out here." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open the door, but I had already made a mistake. I had let whoever was out there know that I was home alone. I turned and ran back to the den, grabbing the controller and putting the headset back on. "Cody, someone's at my door," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is it your parents?" he asked. "No, it's some guy. He says he needs to use the phone." "Don't open the door, man. Just ignore him." Yeah, you're right." But then, the doorbell rang again, and this time it was followed by a loud banging on the door. The sound echoed through the house, making my blood run cold. I told Cody about it, and he cursed under his breath. "Yo, what the hell? Just stay put, dude. Don't open that door." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My heart was racing now, my palms sweaty as I gripped the controller. I tried to focus on the game, tried to lose myself in the familiar sounds and sights, but it was no use. My mind kept drifting back to the front door, with the man standing out there in the storm. The doorbell rang again, and this time it was accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the porch. My blood turned to ice as I realized that whoever was out there wasn't leaving. I stood up, my hands trembling as I moved toward the door again. I didn't know what I was going to do. My parents had always told me to never open the door to strangers, but I couldn't just ignore this. What if the man was really in trouble? I reached the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside. The man was standing on the porch, his face obscured by the shadows. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a hunched posture. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his body like a second skin. He leaned in closer, and I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that gleamed in the darkness. "Please, kid, just let me in for a minute," he said, his voice low and desperate. "I just need to use the phone." I hesitated, my hand gripping the door so tightly that my knuckles turned white. There was something wrong with this man. something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. I can't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You need to leave. The man's face twisted into a snarl, and he slammed his hand against the door, making me jump back in fear. Open the door, he roared, his voice echoing through the house. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key. I backed away, my heart racing, and ran to the den, slamming that door behind me too. Bodhi, I'm freaking out, man. He's trying to get in, I said, my voice trembling. Get out of there, David. Run to a neighbor's house or something. I didn't finish my sentence. A loud crash came from the front of the house, followed by the sound of glass shattering. My blood turned to ice. He was breaking in. I dropped the controller and ran to the office, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. The room was dark, only light coming from the computer monitor on the desk. I stood there, my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the occasional roll of thunder. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hall toward the office. Little boy, the man called out, his voice eerily calm now. I just need to use your phone. I'm stranded in the rain. I pressed myself against the door, my mind racing. The office had 2 doors, one leading to the den, and the other to the garage. My only chance of escape was through the garage, but I was too scared to move. The doorknob rattled, and I bit back a scream. He was trying to get in. Open the door, he growled, his voice growing more agitated. Open the fucking door. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. Took a deep breath, steeling myself, and bolted for the garage door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. Finally got it open. I hit the button to open the garage door, praying that it would be quiet enough that the man wouldn't hear it. The door started to rise, creaking as it did. It was painfully slow, each second feeling like an eternity. I could hear the man pounding on the office door now, shouting obscenities as he tried to break it down. Come on, I silently urged the garage door. It was up halfway now, and I could see the storm raging outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't care. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled under the door, into the storm. As soon as I was outside, I took off running, my feet splashing through the puddles as I sprinted down the street. The rain was blinding, and the wind whipped at my face, but I didn't stop. I had to get to a neighbor's house, had to find help. I saw a light on a few houses down and made a beeline for it, my lungs burning from the effort. It was Julian's house. He was an older man who lived alone, and I knew he'd help me. I reached the front door and pounded on it, glancing back over my shoulder at my house. The garage door was still open, but I didn't see anyone coming out. Please, Julian, open the door, I thought desperate. Finally, the door swung open, and Julian stood there, his face a mix of concern and confusion. David, what are you doing out here in this storm? Someone's in my house, I cried, throwing myself into his arms. He broke in. He was trying to get me. Julian's expression changed instantly, and he pulled me inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Stay here, he said, grabbing his phone. I'm calling the police. I stood in the hallway, dripping wet and shaking with fear. Julian's house was warm and safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, that he would find me. Julian spoke into the phone, his voice calm and authoritative. Yes, this is Julian Knight. I've got a young boy here, David Harris. He says there's an intruder in his house. We're at 227 Maple Street. Please send someone right away. He hung up the phone and turned to me, his expression serious. The police are on their way, David. Don't worry, you're safe here. But I wasn't sure. The storm outside was still raging, and I couldn't shake the image of the man's gaunt, pale face from my mind. He had broken into my house, and I had no idea who he was or what he wanted. We waited in tense silence, the only sound the rain pounding on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Felt like hours before the red and blue lights of a police car flashed outside. Julian opened the door, and 2 officers stepped inside, shaking the rain from their jacket. Where's the boy? One of them asked. Right here, Julian said, guiding them to where I was standing. I told them everything, from the moment the doorbell rang to my escape through the garage. They listened intently, their faces grim, When I mentioned the garage door being left open, one of the officers turned to the other. "Check it out. I'll stay here with the kid." The other officer nodded and headed back outside, disappearing into the storm. The remaining officer knelt down to my level, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, David. You're safe now." But I wasn't sure. My house was just down the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still there, waiting. Julian put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, David. The police will take care of everything." I nodded, trying to believe him. Minutes passed, each one dragging on as the storm raged outside. Finally, the officer who had gone to check the house returned, his face pale. "We found him," he said, his voice low. "He was hiding in the garage." My heart skipped a beat. "Did you arrest him?" The officer nodded. "Yes, we've got him in custody. We'll take him down to the station and notify your parents." "Did he say anything?" Julian asked, his brow furrowed. The officer hesitated, glancing at me before answering. He was refused. Kept insisting that this was his house, that the boy was his son. He didn't seem to be in his right mind. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The man had been claiming that I was his son? What kind of twisted delusion was he living in? "Don't worry," the officer said, noticing the fear on my face. "We'll make sure he doesn't bother you again." But the reassurance did little to calm the fear gnawing at my inside. The man had been in my house, and he had tried to get to me. Even with him in custody, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with me. Julian let me stay the night at his house, and I didn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept expecting to see that gaunt face peering at me from the shadows. When morning came, my parents rushed back from my aunt's house. They were pale and frantic, hugging me tight and asking a million questions. I told them everything, and they promised me that we'd install more locks, get a security system, do whatever it took to make sure I felt safe again. But I knew that no amount of locks or alarms would erase the memory of that man, of the fear I felt when he tried to break down the door. A few weeks later, we found out more about the man who had broken into our house. His name was John McCarty, a drifter who had been in and out of mental institution. He had a history of delusions, often believing he was someone else or that he had a family that didn't exist. My parents pressed charges, and McCarty was sent to a state hospital for treatment. I tried to put it all behind me, but the nightmares persisted. I kept seeing his face, hearing his voice, and feeling his presence in the house. I never felt truly safe again. Every time a storm rolled in, I would find myself staring at the door, waiting for the doorbell to ring, for the nightmare to start all over again. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the rain pounds against the windows, I think I hear his voice whispering from the darkness, "Little boy, let me in." The Visitor. When I was 14, I spent a lot of nights alone. My mom worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and her shifts often stretched into the late hours of the night. My older brother, who had been my protector, left for college a few months before, leaving me to fend for myself. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New England, where the nights were long, dark, and eerily silent. That particular Saturday night felt like any other. My mom had left for her shift around 6 p.m., reminding me to lock all the doors and windows. "Don't open the door for anyone, no matter what," she said before she left. I rolled my eyes but nodded. It was the usual drill. After she left, I invited Molly over. We were sort of seeing each other at the time, awkward teenage romance and all that. We hung out in the living room, watching horror movies on Netflix and eating microwave popcorn. Molly wasn't a fan of scary movies, but I convinced her to watch one with me. The tension in the film made her cling to me, which, at 14, I thought was pretty cool. By 11 p.m., Molly had to go home. Her parents were strict about curfew, and I didn't want to get her in trouble. We said our goodbyes at the front door, and I watched her walk down the street until she disappeared around the corner. That's when the house felt bigger, emptier. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. The kind that makes you aware of every creak and groan the house makes. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just the remnants of the horror movie we'd watched. I turned on the TV in my room, hoping some late-night comedy would drown out the lingering fear. My room was upstairs, and my bed was next to the window that overlooked our backyard. I liked it that way, being able to look out and see the stars. Tonight, the darkness outside seemed oppressive. I was halfway through an episode of some mindless sitcom when I heard it. Faint scraping noise coming from the backyard. I froze, my eyes darting towards the window. My first thought was that it was just the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate dragging that sent shivers down my spine. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept towards the window. Peering out into the darkness, I scanned the backyard, which was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the deck. And then I saw it. Figure sitting on one of the deck chairs, motionless. My first instinct was to call out Molly's name, thinking she might have forgotten something and come back. But as the figure slowly raised its head to look up at me, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that it wasn't her. It was a man. His face was obscured by shadows. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Cold, primal fear gripped me. I quickly ducked down, hiding below the windowsill. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I told myself it had to be a neighbor or maybe someone who wandered into our yard by mistake. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I pulled out my phone and texted a few friends in our group chat, asking if one of them was playing a prank on me. The responses came quickly. Know why? What's going on? Are you okay? I didn't reply. My hands were trembling too much. I glanced back at the window, fighting the urge to peek out again. I wanted to believe it was just some harmless prank. Something in my gut told me otherwise. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to peek out the window again. The man was still there, sitting in the same position, but now he was looking directly up at my window. The dim light cast eerie shadows across his face, making it hard to make out any details. But I could see his eyes, two dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. I didn't want him to know I was still there. Curled up on my bed, hugging my knees to my chest. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I didn't dare turn on my phone again, afraid that even the faint glow of the screen would give me away. Minutes dragged by. Fear was suffocating, paralyzing me. I kept telling myself that he would leave, that he couldn't just sit there all night. But when I finally gathered the courage to look out the window again, he was still there. This time he wasn't just sitting, he was laughing. At first it was silent, just his shoulders shaking as if he were convulsing with laughter. Then slowly, the sound began to creep through the night. A wheezing, gasping noise that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from joy. It was something else, something darker. I felt sick. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. The sound of his laughter seemed to fill the room, growing louder and more distorted, like a bad dream that you can't wake up from. I wanted to scream at him to go away, to leave me alone. The words stuck in my throat. All I could do was watch in horror as he continued to laugh, his head thrown back, eyes fixed on my window. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The man lowered his head and just sat there, motionless once again. Couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the window, trying to think of what to do. I knew I should call the police, but I was terrified that the moment I moved, he would do something, try to break in, or worse. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage with a predator lurking just outside. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled on my bed, too afraid to move. Time seemed to stretch out, each second feeling like an hour. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen, each one worse than the last. Then I heard it, the sound of the back door creaking open. My blood turned to ice. I knew I had locked it, but the sound was unmistakable. He was in the house. I bolted up from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, listening to the faint sound of footsteps moving through the house. They were slow, deliberate, as if he were savoring each step. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for him to find me. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to my bedroom door, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hand was shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. Footsteps grew closer, echoing up the staircase. He was coming. I crept out of my room and down the hallway, towards the stairs. The only light came from the moon shining through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. I could hear him now, breathing heavily as he made his way up the stairs. There was no time to think. I ran to the top of the stairs and peered down, hoping to see something, anything that would tell me where he was. But the darkness below was impenetrable. All I could hear was the slow, steady creak of the stairs as he climbed. I was trapped. The only way out was down the stairs, but that's where he was. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. Then an idea came to me. I turned and ran back to my room, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. I threw open the window and looked down. It was a long drop to the ground, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay in the house with him. I climbed out onto the ledge, my hands gripping the sides of the window frame. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I swung my legs over the edge and dangled there for a moment, trying to gather the courage to let go. The sound of the door creaking open behind me made the decision for me. I let go. The fall seemed to last forever, but it ended with a painful thud. I hit the ground, gasped in pain, feeling the jolt shoot up my legs and through my spine. But I couldn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle, and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get as far away from the house as possible. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent. I ran until my lungs burned, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I stopped, collapsing onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, a chaotic whirl of fear and panic. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely press the button. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. There's someone in my house. Please send help. I gave them my address and then sat there, trembling, waiting for the sound of sirens. Police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. When they got to the house, they searched every room, every corner, but the man was gone. They found the back door ajar, the lock broken. There was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. They questioned me for hours, trying to get a description of the man, but I couldn't give them much. His face was always in shadow, its features blurred by the darkness. All I could remember were his eyes, those dark, soulless pits, and his laughter. My mom came home early from her shift, frantic and angry. She couldn't believe I hadn't called her sooner, that I hadn't called 911 the moment I saw the man in the backyard. I tried to explain, but the words just wouldn't come. The fear had paralyzed me, made me stupid. The police stayed for the rest of the night, patrolling the area, but they never found him. They told us it was probably just a drifter, someone looking for an easy target. But I knew it was more than that. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I would lie in bed, staring at the window, waiting for the sound of scraping, waiting for those eyes to appear in the darkness. He never came back. Even as I grew older, the memory of that night never left me. It haunted my dreams, turned every shadow into a threat, every creak into a warning. I never told anyone the full story. Not my mom, not even Molly. I didn't want to relive it. But the fear stayed with me, constant reminder of that night. I could never shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And every time I heard a laugh in the distance, my blood would run cold, and I would remember those dark, soulless eyes staring up at me from the darkness. Because deep down, I knew that he wasn't just a drifter. He wasn't just some random stranger who stumbled into my yard. He was something else, something evil. And one day, I fear he'll come back. Years later, when I had finally moved out of that house and started a new life, I received a letter. There was no return address, no name, just a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I read the words scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven letters. I'm still watching. That night, the nightmares returned. And this time, I knew they weren't just dreams. The shadows of Maple Street. Maple Street was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of town where neighbors chatted over fences and kids played in the street until the sun went down. But on that Friday night, the ordinary mask of Maple Street was ripped away, revealing something far more sinister. I was 10 years old that night, youngest of 3 siblings. My older brother Alex was 14, and my little sister, Lily, was just 5. That night started like any other. My parents were out, rushing to the hospital because of a phone call that shattered our peace. Alex had been hit by a car while out with his friends, and though he wasn't in immediate danger, his leg was broken badly. My parents were frantic, and I could feel their fear like a thick fog in our house. I was in my room, playing my Star Wars video game, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding downstairs. The game was my escape. Galaxy far, far away where I could be a hero without real consequence. That illusion was shattered when I heard my mom's sobs. The cries were raw, filled with a desperation that made my stomach churn. I scrambled out of my room to see what was wrong, but I was met with the sight of my mom, hunched over the phone, her face a mask of worry. "Please, just tell me he's okay," she cried into the receiver. I wanted to rush to her, offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, until my dad came running up the stairs. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of moments. He put a hand on my mom's shoulder and said, "We need to go. They're waiting for us." As they hurried to grab their coats and wake Lily, my dad glanced at me and asked, "Can you stay here by yourself, buddy?" "I'll be okay," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My parents hurried out of the house, and I was left alone, a child abandoned in the safety of the ordinary, now tinged with a sense of dread. House, once a haven, now felt like a cage. The comfort of my room, now a prison. For hours I sat alone, playing the Star Wars game to distract myself. The sound of the blaster fire and lightsabers clashing was a poor substitute for the laughter and chatter of my family. Clock ticked louder with every passing minute, rhythm a constant reminder of my solitude. It was well past midnight when I heard the front door creak open. My heart raced. I had turned off the TV and the PlayStation, trying to pretend that I was asleep. I pulled my Game Boy from beneath the covers and tried to focus on the tiny screen, but my mind was elsewhere. The silence downstairs stretched on, and I began to feel uneasy. My parents should have been back by now. I crept to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear any familiar voices. There was nothing but an eerie silence. I slowly opened the door and peeked out. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the windows. The living room below was pitch black, save for a faint moonlight that barely illuminated the room. 3 figures stood in the middle of the living room, their shapes looming and indistinct. They weren't my family. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my throat as I silently retreated back into my room, closing the door with painstaking care. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I scrambled into the closet, pushing aside boxes and old clothes to create a small hiding spot. My heart pounded in my ears as I sat huddled behind the piles, praying that I wouldn't be found. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder and more deliberate. The footsteps came up the stairs, and my worst fears were realized when they reached my door. I held my breath, fear almost suffocating. Bedroom door creaked open, and I heard the footsteps move towards my bed. The sound of the bed covers rustling was almost unbearable. Then there was silence, followed by the slow, deliberate approach towards my closet. I sat in the darkness, shaking. Closet door creaked open, and I knew I was exposed. I didn't dare to move or make a sound. The door stayed open for what felt like an eternity. I could feel the breath of whoever was in the room. I couldn't see them. My body was rigid with fear, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen. Finally, closet door closed, and the footsteps retreated from the room. The silence was oppressive. I stayed hidden for what felt like an age before I dared to move. My limbs felt numb as I carefully peered out from behind the boxes. The room was empty. The sense of dread lingered. I waited another hour, my nerves frayed. When I finally heard the sound of my parents' voices downstairs, I raced down, nearly tripping over my own feet. The front door was ajar, the lock obviously not secured in their rush. My parents were disheveled and exhausted. They looked around the house in shock. "They've stolen everything," my mom cried out, her voice cracking with distress. I was too stunned to speak. The living room was in disarray, with drawers pulled open and valuables missing. It wasn't just the theft that had rattled me. It was the realization of how close I had come to being discovered. My father hugged me tightly, his relief evident. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" His voice trembled with concern. I'm fine," stammered. "I just hid in the closet." They exchanged a worried glance. "We should have been more careful," my dad said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We should have locked the door." The police came later, and the house was scoured for fingerprints. But the intruders had left no trace. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only the shroud of fear behind them. The nights that followed were filled with nightmares. The shadows in my room seemed darker and the silence more oppressive. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of those shadowy figures haunting me. In the end, we were left with questions and fears that would never fully be answered. Why did they come? What would have happened if I had been found? Did they see me hiding in the closet, or was it sheer luck that kept me safe? As I grew older, the terror of that night faded into the background, but it never truly left me. Maple Street returned to its usual routine, but I knew that beneath its placid surface there were shadows waiting to emerge. And every now and then, when the night was still and the darkness seemed too close, I would remember that Friday night and wonder if the shadows of Maple Street had ever truly gone away. Ever since I was a kid, fishing was a family tradition. No, more like an obsession. Every summer, the older men in my family would drag me along on their fishing trips, teaching me the ropes, showing me how to cast, reel, and weight. I was the youngest, so naturally, I was expected to become the next expert in the family. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother, Tom. Our house looked like something straight out of a fishing magazine. Rods, tackle boxes, mounted fish on the walls, the whole 9 yards. If you walked into our living room, you'd think we spent more time on the water than on land. But this story isn't about me. It's about my dad, Mark. He's the kind of man who's seen it all, or so I thought. There aren't many things that rattle him, but when he tells this story, it's like he becomes a different person. You can see it in his eyes, the way his voice wavers, like he's right back in that moment, feeling the terror all over again. It happened on one of those fishing trips. My dad, his brother Tom, and their close friends, Luke, Jerry, and Greg, had planned the trip for weeks. They were going to a spot they considered a hidden gem, a secluded cove a couple of hours by boat from the nearest marina. It was their favorite spot, known for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The kind of place where they could fish all day without seeing another soul. They set out early, long before the sun had even touched the horizon. The boat cut through the mist that hovered above the water, everyone laughing and joking as they went. They anchored the boat in the cove, surrounded by dense forest. The place was perfect, just as they'd remembered. As they settled in, cracking open their first beers of the day, despite the early hour, the atmosphere was light, almost festive. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a fish hitting the water, the hum of the boat's engine, and their own laughter. But as the day wore on, something shifted. The light began to fade, and a thick fog rolled in from the water, swallowing the boat in its eerie embrace. My dad describes it as if the world around them disappeared, leaving them in a ghostly void. Luke, the most experienced fisherman among them, muttered that he had never seen fog so dense. It wasn't natural. Jerry, the joker of the group, was almost as drunk as Greg by this point, and neither seemed to notice the growing unease that had settled over the others. My dad and Luke exchanged worried glances. Fog wasn't lifting, and it was starting to get dark. They figured they could wait it out, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the fog wasn't going anywhere. Tom, usually the cautious one, suggested they try to navigate out of the cove and into the open water, where the fog might be less dense. But even as he tried, they narrowly avoided crashing into the shore. The fog was too thick, the darkness too impenetrable. They had no choice but to spend the night on the boat. My dad was worried. He needed to contact his office about some urgent business. There was no signal. They had drifted into a dead zone, part of the cove where their phones were useless. He, Luke, and Jerry decided to go ashore in search of higher ground, hoping to find a signal. They left Tom and Greg on the boat, with Tom promising to keep an eye on things. They made their way to shore, the boat rocking gently as they disembarked. My dad grabbed the emergency flare gun from the boat, just in case. The three of them set off into the woods, beams from their flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. They weren't scared, they were experienced outdoorsmen. But there was something about that night, something in the air that made my dad's skin crawl. As they trekked uphill, the fog seemed to follow them, clinging to the trees like a living thing. My dad often says it felt like the fog was trying to trap them, keep them from leaving the cove. They pushed on, the forest around them growing denser, darker. Then, without warning, a strange sound broke the silence. A series of clicks, rhythmic yet erratic, coming from somewhere ahead of them. They froze, straining their ears to listen. Clicks were human-made, that much was clear. And they were getting closer. Luke, who had been in more than his fair share of dangerous situations, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, his voice tinged with genuine fear. They did as he said, plunging themselves into darkness. The clicking stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, making it hard to breathe. My dad's heart was pounding in his chest. He knew they weren't alone. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a rustling in the bushes, just a few feet away. Then another noise, this one a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my dad's spine. They stood there, paralyzed with fear, as something big moved through the underbrush. And then, all at once, the forest erupted in chaos. There were screams, inhuman, primal sounds that echoed through the trees. Kind of screams that make your blood run cold. Without thinking, my dad fired the flare gun. Bright red light cut through the fog, illuminating the forest for just a moment. What they saw was the stuff of nightmares. In the brief flash of light, they saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, dressed in tattered, primitive clothing, their faces obscured by mud and what looked like animal skin. They were holding spears, crude weapons that looked like they had been fashioned out of sharpened wood. There were at least 10 of them, maybe more, standing in a loose circle around the clearing, watching them with cold, empty eyes. Jerry screamed, stumbling back, but Luke grabbed him, pulling him to his feet. "Run," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. They didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes, roots tripping them up at every step. The sounds of pursuit were right behind them, footsteps, growls, the snapping of branches as their pursuers closed in. My dad's lungs burned. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but he kept running, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate will to survive. They burst out of the forest, gasping for breath, and stumbled back to the boat. "Start the engine," my dad yelled at Tom, who was already scrambling to get the boat moving. They leaped onto the deck just as the engine roared to life, the boat lurching forward, away from the shore. As they sped away, my dad fired another flare back towards the forest. For a split second, the light illuminated the shoreline, and they saw them again, the figures standing at the water's edge, watching them with those cold, empty eyes. There were more of them now, at least 15, maybe 20. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched as the boat sped away into the darkness. The light from the flare faded, and the figures disappeared into the fog once more. The boat sped on, the engine the only sound as they left the cove behind. My dad, Luke, and Jerry were shaking, their minds racing to process what they had just seen. They didn't stop until they were miles away from the cove, out in open water where the fog wasn't as thick. They anchored the boat and sat there in silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull. No one spoke for a long time. What could they say? How could they even begin to explain what had just happened? Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they took turns keeping watch while the others tried to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time my dad closed his eyes, he saw those figures standing at the water's edge, waiting, watching. They left the cove at first light, fog finally lifting as the sun rose. They didn't talk about what had happened, didn't try to make sense of it. They just wanted to get home, to leave that place far behind them. When they finally made it back to the marina, they were different men. They didn't laugh, didn't joke like they usually did after a fishing trip. They were quiet, haunted by what they had seen. My dad doesn't like to talk about that night. When he does, you can see the fear in his eyes, hear it in his voice. Whatever they saw in that forest, it wasn't human. And it's something he'll never forget. I still get chills whenever I think about it. And I can't even begin to imagine what my dad feels when he remembers that night, when the forest echoed with the sound of something dark and ancient, something that should have stayed hidden. Echoes in the dark. David's house was one of those classic two-story American homes, sitting quietly on the outskirts of a sleepy town in upstate New York. The house had an eerie charm, old but well-kept, with a creaky wooden porch and ivy crawling up the sides. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque during the day but had a different, almost sinister vibe when night fell. David lived there with his sister, Emily. It was a mother-daughter style house, meaning there were two separate living spaces, one on each floor, each with its own kitchen, living room, and bedroom. Emily took the downstairs while David claimed the upper floor. Emily wasn't home much. She spent most nights at her boyfriend's place, about 20 miles away, leaving David alone in the big, empty house. At 30, he was used to being on his own, and he liked to think he wasn't the kind of guy who got scared easily. But sometimes, just sometimes, the isolation got to him, especially late at night, when shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, and every creak of the house felt like someone or something was watching him. This particular night, David was alone again. Emily had texted earlier, saying she wouldn't be home, so he had the place to himself. He decided to make the most of it by watching a horror movie in the living room. The upstairs space had an open layout, with the living room, dining room, and kitchen all blending into one large area. David's couch was in the middle of the room, positioned so that his back was to a vast, dark expanse of the house. It wasn't the most comfortable setup for watching a scary movie. David didn't mind, or at least he told himself that. As the movie played on, the room was bathed in the flickering light from the TV, the only source of illumination in the otherwise pitch-black space. David found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than he cared to admit. Each time he'd catch sight of nothing but darkness behind him. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. The movie wasn't even that scary, he reasoned. So why did he feel so uneasy? When the credits finally rolled, David let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He shut off the TV, casting the room into complete darkness, and made his way to the bathroom to brush his teeth. The house was eerily silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. After finishing up, David turned off all the lights and headed to bed. He fell asleep quickly, the weariness from a long day overtaking any lingering anxiety from the movie. But his sleep didn't last long. He woke with a start a couple of hours later, the digital clock on his nightstand glowing 1:03 a.m. He wasn't sure what had woken him, but he felt disoriented, the remnants of a dream fading away too quickly to grasp. As he lay there, trying to make sense of the sudden wakefulness, he heard it, his sister's voice. David. The voice was muffled but unmistakable. It was Emily calling out to him from downstairs. David blinked, his mind still foggy with sleep. What was she doing here? She'd said she wasn't coming home tonight, and why was she yelling? Was something wrong? He sat up in bed, listening intently. The house was silent again, but he could have sworn he'd heard her. Maybe she was arguing with her boyfriend and had come back to the house without him noticing. He got out of bed and made his way to the hallway, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. He fumbled for the light switch, finally flicking it on, and the dim bulb overhead cast a weak yellowish glow down the narrow hall. "Emily?" David called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. No response. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard her again, this time clearer and more insistent. "David, down here!" Her voice was coming from downstairs, from her part of the house. David felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this didn't feel right, but he couldn't just ignore her. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing ominously in the silence. As he descended, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, almost palpable, as if the shadows themselves were alive. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused, trying to remember where the light switch was in the foyer. His hand brushed against the wall, searching for the switch, but he couldn't find it. His heart was pounding in his chest, cold sweat forming on his brow. Emily? Called again, but there was no answer this time. He stepped into the small hallway that led to her kitchen, finally finding the light switch and flicking it on. The bulb sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering light across the room. The kitchen was empty, and the silence was deafening. Emily? David's voice trembled slightly as he called out again. No response. He walked through the kitchen into her living room, the dim light from the kitchen barely reaching the far corners of the room. It was empty, too. His sister's belongings were there. Her favorite blanket draped over the back of the couch, her coffee mug sitting on the table, but there was no sign of her. David's unease grew stronger. He checked her bedroom, but it was just as empty. The bed was neatly made, nothing out of place. He called her name one last time, louder now, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. And then, just as the silence began to settle in again, he heard it. A soft thud, like something had fallen to the floor, coming from her bedroom, the same room he'd just checked and found empty. David's blood ran cold. He backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to get out, to run back upstairs and lock the door. But his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. Forcing himself to move, he turned and bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He stumbled into his bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. His phone was on the nightstand, and with trembling hands, he grabbed it and dialed Emily's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He tried again and again, but each time there was no answer. David sat on the edge of his bed, phone clutched in his hand, trying to convince himself that he had imagined it all. He was groggy, half asleep, probably just hearing things. But the memory of his sister's voice, so clear and so desperate, refused to fade. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by fragmented dreams of dark, empty rooms and echoes of his sister's voice calling to him from the shadows. The next morning, David was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a text from Emily, asking why he'd called her so many times in the middle of the night. His stomach twisted as he read the message. He quickly replied, asking if she had come home last night. Her response came almost immediately. No, I stayed at Sam's place all night. Why? David's heart sank. He got up, hesitating for a moment before heading downstairs to Emily's bedroom. The room was exactly as he'd left it. Neatly made bed, nothing out of place. He searched the floor, looking for anything that might have made the sound he'd heard the night before. But there was nothing. No fallen object, no sign that anyone had been there. A cold dread settled over him as he realized the implications. He wanted to believe that it had all been a dream, a trick of his tired mind. But deep down, he knew that something far more sinister had happened. The voice he'd heard, the sounds in the empty room, they were too vivid, too real to be mere hallucinations. David spent the day in a fog, going through the motions of his routine but unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak of the house sent shivers down his spine. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the unease only grew as the day wore on. That night, David was determined not to be caught off guard again. He kept the lights on in every room, double-checked the locks on the doors, and even considered calling a friend to stay over. But in the end, he decided against it, not wanting to seem paranoid. He settled onto the couch with a book, trying to distract himself from the creeping dread that had taken hold of him. Hours passed, and the house remained silent. The clock ticked past midnight, and David felt a small sense of relief. Maybe it had all been in his head. Maybe he was just tired and stressed, and his mind had conjured up something that wasn't there. But then, just as he was beginning to relax, The lights in the house flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. David's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone, but before he could turn on the flashlight, he heard it again. David? It was his sister's voice, but this time it was different. It was distorted, as if coming from a great distance or through water. The sound sent chills down his spine, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. David, help me. The voice was closer now, coming from the hallway. David stood frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he should move, should do something, but his body refused to obey. David? The voice was right outside the living room door, and then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. David backed away, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to run, but his legs felt like lead. The door creaked open, and in the darkness, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was his sister, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong, something horribly wrong. Her eyes were too dark, her skin too pale, and her movements were jerky, unnatural. David, help me. The voice was a hollow, echoing mockery of his sister's, and as the figure stepped into the room, David could see that it wasn't his sister at all. It was something else, something wearing her face like a mask. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, and he fell hard onto the floor. The figure moved closer, its limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. David, it reached out a hand, the fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. David scrambled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had to get away, had to get out of the house, but the thing was closing in on him, its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, boring into his soul. Just as the figure was about to touch him, the lights in the house flickered back on. The room was empty. The door was closed. There was no sign of the figure, no sign that anything had been there at all. David lay on the floor, trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had it been another hallucination? A dream? But it had felt so real, so terrifyingly real. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on the couch, every light in the house blazing, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, waiting for the figure to return. But the house remained silent. The next morning, David called Emily. He needed to hear her voice, needed to know she was okay. She answered on the second ring, sounding groggy but otherwise fine. David, what's going on? You sound weird. Emily, are you sure you didn't come home last night? There was a pause on the other end of the line. No, I told you. I stayed at Sam's. Why? Did something happen? David hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. I thought I heard you. I thought you were here. Another pause, longer this time. David, are you okay? You don't sound like yourself. He swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. I'm fine. I must have been dreaming. Emily didn't sound convinced, but she let it go. Okay, well, I'll be home later today. Maybe we can talk then? Yeah, David said, his voice hollow. Maybe. That evening, Emily returned home. David was relieved to see her, but the relief was short-lived. As they sat together in the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily seemed fine, but there was an undercurrent of tension between them, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of them wanted to discuss. Finally, David broke the silence. Emily, has anything strange happened to you here? Anything you can't explain? Emily looked at him, her expression guarded. What do you mean? I don't know, David said, running a hand through his hair. I've been hearing things, seeing things. I thought I heard you last night, but you weren't here. And then there was this figure. Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. David pressed on, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. It looked like you, but it wasn't you. It was something else, something wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt so real. Emily was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. David, there's something I need to tell you. David's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. I've been seeing things too, hearing things. It started a few weeks ago, but I didn't want to say anything because I thought I was going crazy. But now I think there's something wrong with this house. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What do you mean? I don't know, Emily said, her voice trembling. But whatever it is, it's getting worse. I feel like it's watching us, like it's waiting for something. David's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Could it be possible? Could the house be haunted, or cursed, or something even worse? As they sat there in the growing darkness, the shadows seemed to close in around them, pressing down on them from all sides. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and David knew, deep down, that they were no longer alone. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. David and Emily tried to go about their lives as normally as possible. The sense of unease never left them. The house felt different, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. They heard whispers in the night, footsteps in empty rooms, and saw fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corners of their eyes. The thing that had appeared to David that night never showed itself again, but its presence was always there, lurking just out of sight. David knew it was only a matter of time before it came back, before it tried to take them. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, David and Emily made a decision. They couldn't stay there any longer. They had to leave, to get as far away from the house as possible. They packed their bags in a hurry, barely speaking to each other, the fear driving them to move as quickly as possible. As they reached the front door, ready to make their escape, the lights in the house flickered once more, then went out completely. In the darkness, David heard it again. His sister's voice, distorted and hollow, echoing through the house. "David, help me." He turned to Emily, but she was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. The voice came again, closer this time. "David." And then the figure appeared in the doorway, just as it had before. But this time there were more of them. Shadowy, twisted figures, all wearing the faces of people David knew, people who were long gone. They reached out for him, their hands cold and clammy, their eyes empty voids. David felt a scream rising in his throat, but no sound came out. The figures closed in, their touch freezing to the core. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The lights flickered back on and the figures were gone. David was standing in the foyer, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Emily was beside him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "David, we have to go. Now." David nodded, unable to speak, and they ran out of the house into the pouring rain. They didn't stop until they were far away, the house a distant shadow on the horizon. David and Emily never returned to that house. They left it behind, along with the nightmares that had plagued them there. They moved to a new town, a new home, trying to put the past behind them. The memories lingered, haunting them in the dark corners of their minds. And sometimes, late at night, David would wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of his sister's voice still ringing in his ears, calling to him from the darkness. "David, help me." In the small town of Parsonsfield, Maine, where every street seemed to whisper secrets of the past, there was a hidden lake, shrouded in mystery, and only accessible by a well-worn path through dense woods. It was a sanctuary for me, a quiet retreat from the monotony of daily life, and I had spent countless hours fishing there. The lake was remote, secluded from roads and neighboring houses. Its isolation was its charm, and it offered perfect privacy. I kept my kayak in the same spot by the lake, propped up against a massive oak tree, away from prying eyes and the elements. It was a convenient solution, allowing me to avoid the hassle, transporting it back and forth from my house. One summer evening, as dusk began to drape its cloak over the landscape, I set out to enjoy a quiet fishing session. The sky was a deepening shade of purple, and the gentle lapping of water against the kayak was soothing. I had already caught a handful of trout, which I placed in a cooler, savoring the simple pleasures of solitude and nature. Just as the last remnants of daylight surrendered to the encroaching night, an unusual noise shattered the calm. I turned to see a figure at the edge of the lake. They were dragging a large barrel, contents sloshing ominously as they poured a dark, viscous liquid into the lake. My heart pounded as a sense of unease prickled at my spine. The liquid was a deep red, almost black in the fading light, and it seemed to churn and bubble as it mixed with the clear water. Unable to suppress my growing apprehension, I called out, "Hey, what are you doing?" The figure, a man clad in dark clothing, looked up briefly before bolting into the woods, leaving the barrel's contents to seep into the lake. I watched in horror as the dark liquid continued to spread, staining pristine water. My gut told me something was terribly wrong. Determined to act, I hastily paddled back to shore, my mind racing with thoughts of reporting the incident to the authorities. As I approached the bank, I heard a faint, eerie snap of a twig nearby. I spun around, my heart racing, saw nothing. Ignoring the unsettling feeling, I quickly covered my kayak and left it lying on the ground, grabbing my gear and cooler with trembling hands. The walk back to my house was a blur of anxiety. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. The sensation of being watched clung to me like a shadow, intensifying with every step I took. Once home, I shoved my gear into the shed and locked the door with a sense of urgency, as though securing my home would somehow ward off the impending danger. Inside, I tried to calm my frayed nerves. I rinsed the trout and placed them in the fridge, planning to cook them the next day. The microwave beeped, signaling that my leftovers were ready, when a sudden knock at the front door sent a jolt of fear through me. The knocking was persistent, followed by a man's voice calling from outside. "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd just like to explain myself." My pulse quickened. There was no way I was opening the door to this stranger. The idea of him stalking me to my home was terrifying. I peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. My heart pounded as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I shouted through the door, "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The man's voice softened, almost mocking. "Sir, if you could just open the door, I'll explain everything to you." The calmness in his voice only heightened my fear. I repeated my threat, my hand shaking as I dialed the non-emergency police number. I reported the suspicious activity at the lake and the unsettling visit to my house, hoping that the authorities would take my concerns seriously. As I locked all the windows and turned on the air conditioning, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. But as the night wore on, the house felt eerily quiet. I settled on the couch, my gun close by, watching TV to distract myself. The sense of dread that had plagued me all evening resurfaced, making every creak and groan of the house seem ominous. At around 2 a.m., a loud crash from downstairs jolted me awake. My heart raced as I grabbed my Glock from the closet. I crept through the darkened hallway, every step amplified by the eerie silence. The footsteps I heard on the stairs were slow and deliberate, sending a chill down my spine. I hid behind the dresser near my bedroom door, aiming my gun at the entrance. The door handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open. A silhouette stood in the doorway, casting a long shadow into the room. I flicked on the lamp, illuminating the intruder, a man with a small blade in hand. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his expression eerily calm. "Get on the ground now," I screamed, my voice echoing with a mix of fear and authority. He seemed to hesitate, then said softly, "I'm leaving." He turned and fled down the stairs. I shouted after him, but he was already gone. I raced downstairs, locking the front door and calling 911. The living room window was shattered, glass scattered across the floor. I stayed by the broken window, watching for any sign of the intruder until the police arrived. They took my report and inspected the damage, but the man was nowhere to be found. The next morning, I accompanied 2 officers back to the lake, hoping to find the barrel or any trace of the mysterious liquid. But after searching for 20 minutes, we found nothing. The man had clearly taken great care to cover his tracks. I provided a detailed description of him. Short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, dressed in black flannel and pants. With the police gone, I returned home and spent the day with my brother Dale, who had come over to help fix the window. My other brother and I went to Home Depot for the necessary materials. Dale stayed with me for a few nights, his presence a small comfort in the midst of my growing paranoia. The theory that haunted me was dark and unsettling. I couldn't shake the thought that the barrel might have contained human remain, possibly dissolved in acid. The man's desperate attempt to avoid detection and his brazen intrusion into my home only strengthened my fear. Why else would someone go to such lengths to keep their actions secret? I trusted my instincts that night. Feeling of danger was palpable, and I knew that opening the door could have led to something far more sinister. As the days passed, I found solace in the company of my brother and the presence of the police, but the shadow of that night lingered. The hidden lake, once a peaceful retreat, had become a haunting reminder of the unseen depths that lay beneath its surface. In the quiet of the nights that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching from the shadows. The woods around the lake seemed darker, the whispers of the trees more foreboding, and every time I passed by that oak tree where I used to leave my kayak, I felt a shiver of unease, as though the darkness held secrets I was never meant to uncover. I never went back to that lake. It remained a hidden part of my past. A place where something dark and inexplicable had seeped into the water in my life. The memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that lurk in the unseen depths.